I'm very skillful at being opportunistic about exploiting people's and my father. And so this was one of those cases where I got this great job with zero training as a journalist to join this incredible organization. And the first thing I did, of course, the guy who hired me, he had this idea of making Channel 1 into a much more spiritual channel, whatever that meant. And the first thing I did was I said, yeah, I'm here and I'm really excited and grateful for this opportunity. I want to go cover wars. And so I got this opportunity and to spend about 5 years covering all these conflict areas, war zones. And I think, what it really was the backlash in some ways against the spiritual upbringing I had, was to say, yes, spirituality, faith, all of this is great, but there's all these things going on in the world, and I'm trying to reconcile, this way I've been brought up, these 7 spiritual laws, and all of these amazing spiritual principles, and all of these amazing spiritual people that I've grown up around, with what I see on the news. And I was still just seeing it in the news at that time. I wanted to go touch it and feel it and understand it. So I got this amazing opportunity. I spent a number of years traveling around the world, going to places, Colombia and Pakistan, so hanging out with narco traffickers and suicide bombers and all these crazy, crazy things. Wherever you can think of, horrible stuff going on in the world, that's where I was going. It happens to be, great television. People love seeing, wars and terrorism and all of this stuff. And by the way, this was, I'm going to age myself, but this was pre-2001. So it was sort of a different world at that time. And what happened around that time, it was the year 2000 actually, Channel 1 struck up a joint venture with another television network here in Los Angeles. And the idea was, young people don't watch the news. That's kind of one of the things that all the statistics tell you. And Channel 1 was one of the very few places that sent young journalists out into the world to cover these things and then, broadcast it to students. So this news network this television network came to us and said, we want to do a show with you, and in classic Hollywood style, we pitched it as, we're going to do 60 minutes, the sort of absolute pedigree in news television, meet Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So, of course, the network bought it and said, oh, that's cool, we can do that. So, I'm going to tell you the story of kind of what happened in the pilot season of that venture. So, what happened was February of 2001, and we were all sitting around a round table talking about stories that could make up the first 1 hour of this news network. And so everyone's sort of pitching ideas, and I had just recently read, and I had spent a number of years already traveling the world and doing some of these stories, but I had read a news story on these, in the New York Times Sunday magazine, about these religious schools, or madrasas in Pakistan. And I was curious because of my own upbringing, because I had recently been there in Kashmir, covering sort of some of the conflicts there. I was curious about going and seeing for myself what's happening at these religious schools, because like the article talked about, if you talk to sort of people in that part of the world, they said, look, they're just schools that give education to kids, boys, that otherwise would not have any access to schools and education. We talked to the U.S. intelligence agencies, which we did at the time, as journalists, to tell these are terrorist training camps. What's going on in these schools is why there's so many problems in Kashmir at the time, again, pre-2001. Important in terms of the context of the story and where it's going. So, of course, I pitched the story, and the executives, very Hollywood executives, were like, well, I don't know, terrorism, it just seems so far off, Pakistan's so far away, most of our students don't even, most of our audience didn't even know what that is. Somebody else piped in, terrorism is probably involves a lot of guns, and that's great on television. People like to see that sort of stuff. Some other bright executive stood up and said, you know what? We have a hook, and you're always looking for a hook. The hook is that Ben Affleck is going to be a movie that's coming out this summer called The Sum of All Fears, which is about terrorism and all of that. Maybe if we can get Ben to go with you to one of these madrasas or whatever they're called, that would be really cool. So somebody else stood up and said, I don't think the movie studio, the insurance company is going to allow Ben to go off to Pakistan. So we canned the story. We didn't get to do it. But fortunately, Channel 1, who I worked for at the time, said, that's a great story for us, and obviously you have an authentic connection to it, so go do it. So a couple months later, August of 2001, I traveled to India first, and my grandparents. I always see my grandparents. My mommy would kill me if I didn't, see her before, if I'm ever in that part of life. So I go see my grandparents, and then I become the first person in my family, 52 years, to go back to Pakistan. My family immigrated during partition from what became Pakistan into India. I'm sure most of you, or a lot of you, have read United Children, which is like a great book about partition, Salman Rushdie's book, and I've always sort of romanticized it, I guess, in the same way that book does, what partition is. And the truth is, I was the first one to get back, to go back to Pakistan. So it was a sort of interesting journey for me. As a journalist, the first thing I always do when I land myself in a hotel in someplace at a conference, I turn on the TV, and I started looking at what's on television. So we made our way to Peshawar, which is this town in the northwest frontier part of Pakistan, and I turned on the television, and I started flipping the channel. And the first thing I saw was, at the time, was Beavis and Butthead, which hopefully you guys are familiar with. I think it's coming back from what I heard. And then I flipped the channel a little bit more Baywatch, which was another thing my generation and then fashion television with these amazingly emaciated women walking up and down the runways of Milan. And so that was sort of interesting. The next day we jumped in a van and we drove up into the into the Khyber Pass, right? Khyber is this legendary channel or road that connects Pakistan and Afghanistan. And what happens when you go to the border, the beginning of the Khyber, the Pakistani army at the time would escort you up there, and then they would sort of say, this is as far as we can take you, because while the Khyber is controlled by part of Pakistani territory, they don't go in there. They don't mess around with that. So they hand you off, and they say, what you should do is you should hire one of these local militias. These guys kind of control the territory, and you'd rather be on their side than be sort of skirting around them. And the way you get the assistance of these militia guys is the same way as journalists. You learn cigarettes, magazines, and cash. That's how you get assistance. So we did that. We gave these guys, they threw us in the back of a pickup truck, and we started driving up into the Khyber. It was one of the most amazing experiences in my life. I was sitting in the back of this pickup truck with a bunch of guys with bandanas, and they were all carrying AK-47s, and occasionally they would sort of shoot up in the ridge. They would shoot up with their machine guns, and then you would hear guys on the ridge sort of shoot in response. Most of them gave me a gun and said, "You do it." And I remember it as like the most overtly masculine thing I've ever had in shot. Like a machine gun in the back of a pickup truck, and all these other guys did it too, and we all sort of equivalent of high fives. So after about half an hour, we came to this school and this madrasa, and I knocked on the door, and I said, here we are. We had these small digital cameras. It was like the first generation of digital cameras. And we knocked on the door and said, this is who we are, this is who we represent. It was always a great sell to say, hey, we represent 12 million American students who have no clue who you are, and we're not CNN, we're not ABC, we have no agenda. Just let us in, we just want to talk to you and see what's going on. And so invariably they would open the door, and in this case they opened the door. They took me to the back room, and I got to sit down with this mullah, like the equivalent of the headmaster of the school. And we started talking, and he said, look, before I sort of tell you about what's going on in the school, and I'll tell you everything that's going on, and then I'll let you go out, and you can talk to whoever you want to talk to. Let me kind of be a host to you, because in our part of the world, we take this very seriously. You come to be our guest, and we want you to have a good time and say nice things about us. So let me cut you some mangoes. So he had some mangoes brought to us. And this was, he had long beard, and was wearing sort of the traditional dress and everything. And he said to me, he pulled a knife out of his robe, and he started peeling this mango. And he said, so, he could tell of course, then I had an Indian name and all of that. So he asked me about my background and where my family was from India. Then he sort of handed me the mango and said, you'll notice that our mangoes are much sweeter here than they are in India. So we did the whole mango thing, and they were actually really sweet. I couldn't tell my grandmother later that they were actually sweet. I remember, in these really messy slurping mangoes and everything. So after a while, I sort of put it in the plate, and I went to throw the plate in the trash can. And as I was doing that, I noticed on the wall there was this picture, and it was the picture of this mullah who I was eating mangoes with, and Osama bin Laden. And I looked at that picture, and again, keep reminding me, pre-2001. So, Osama bin Laden was still on the 10 most wanted FBI list of fugitives and all of that. There had been, some bombings in Kenya and Somalia. There were a lot of problems in Africa that were sort of linked to Osama bin Laden, but he wasn't sort of the A-list sort of celebrity terrorist that he would become shortly. So, I sort of pulled that picture off, but I knew of him because, as journalists, every time we went to one of these places, we would talk to the State Department and the CIA would sort of, kind of do things to us and just warn you and say, hey, be on the lookout for this X, Y, and Z. So, of course, we knew who this guy was, and I brought that picture back to Mullah, and I sat down and I said, you guys, you look very friendly, like, with this guy. And he said, oh, yeah, he's, a good friend of mine, he's a scholar and a very religious man, and he's very smart, and, he lives in Afghanistan. He comes here very often, but, these days he has some visa problems, so he's not coming home. But maybe next time you come, if you give us some notice, I can take you there and you can interview him. I said, yeah, I'll definitely do that, because in my country we call that a Pulitzer Prize, but so I took the picture down and we started our sort of interview and we started talking, and I started asking him what goes on in the school, and he sort of defended. He said, look, well, we just teach, the Quran, and we do all this stuff, but there's no guns here, there's no knives, there's none of this stuff that people say about us. So I said, well, in our country, yeah, there is a great fear of what's happening here in this school, and in this part of the world, I guess more so than just the school. And he said, well, that is what it is, everybody. And then I remember him saying, which was interesting because it was something I had grown up with, this Hindu principle, which is everyone sees the world as, or reality is just a projection of consciousness, and everyone sees the world from their own point of view. So he said, let me ask you a question about that. He said, where did you stay last night? So I said, I stayed at the Marriott Hotel in Peshawar. And he said, yeah, did you turn on the television? And I said, yeah. He said, what did you see? And I described, with some degree of shame, they watch Beavis and Butthead fashion television, and he said, yeah, so he said, so what do you think? Is it us who has to be afraid of you, or you that has to be afraid of us? Because maybe it's your lifestyle that is the one that we should be afraid of. And, he had made his point. So, we had this great conversation. I was a bit sort of conflicted because in some ways it was true. And he said, go talk to whoever you want to talk to. So I went out and there were a bunch of kids running around, all boys. And I identified one kid who was probably 14 years old and he was wearing a Superman t-shirt. And I always had this fascination with comics. Both here growing up in the United States, but also the Indian comics, which I'm not sure you guys are familiar with the Amar Chitra comics. I'd always sort of collected them and all of that. So I was drawn to this kid, and I went and I started talking to him. And first of all, there were no guns, there was nothing going on in the school, at least sort of visibly. And I started talking to this kid, and I asked him, after a while, like, if you're wearing Superman on your t-shirt, like, are you a fan of Superman? And he said, yeah, I'm a fan of Superman. And I said, do you have any sort of equivalent of Superman in your part of the world, in your culture here? And he laughed, and he said, look around. Look around. The place was pretty desolate. And it was, I remember, 118 degrees at the time. Kids slept on the floor. It was a pretty, harsh place. And he said, here where I live, we don't have superheroes. We don't have, such people to believe in. And I remember that, that sort of hit a chord. So I left this place. I went back to India, talked to my grandparents. I had their house with 3 mangoes. I flew back to New York, where my wife, my fiance at the time, was in medical school. And while I lived in Los Angeles, I was also making pit stops in New York to spend some time with her. And, in this situation, I didn't really have a hook for the story. Sort of like this evergreen story, as we like to call it, like on terrorism, which is an issue in the world, but not necessarily an imminent one. So I spent some time with my wife, and I had, or my girl, my fiance, and I had this bag full of tapes, beta tapes at the time, and some digital tapes. And I got on a flight on the morning of September 11, 2001, with this bag of my crazy experience out in the northwest frontier part of Pakistan. And I took off at 8 a.m. on a Delta flight from JFK to LAX. And I was so happy. Well, I was conflicted because on one hand, I was leaving New York, leaving my fiance. It was an amazing day. We took off. I remember sort of curling around, and we take off from JFK and come up the Hudson, and I saw Columbia, my alma mater, and I was thinking, man, I really wish I didn't have to leave. On the other hand, I'd gotten an upgrade, so I was so happy. I was sitting in business class, and I fell asleep. And about 45 minutes later, a pilot came overhead, and he said, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be making an emergency landing in Cincinnati, Ohio, because of a terrorist attack in the New York and Washington area. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't even know what that means. I mean, what does that mean? And there were other people sort of trying to figure that out. People started calling, using those phones, which they used to have on planes. And I used one, only later discovered it was the most expensive phone call I ever made. Delta Airlines doesn't have empathy for people who, are caught in a terrorist attack. So I used that phone, and I got a hold of my sister, and all I heard her saying is, oh my God, what plane are you on? The Twin Towers have been hit, and then it cut off. And they instructed us nobody was allowed to get up, and we all had to sit there. And the two male stewards came and stood right by the cockpit. I was in business class, and so I got to see this for myself. And they just stood there, and everyone was sort of freaked out. When we landed, got into the airport, and the first thing I saw at the bar, usually where they're playing. Well, they never play Clippers games usually, but they're always playing basketball games or whatever. There was CNN, and it was showing Tower 2, from Tower 2, Tower 1 had already come down to the ground. So I was so confused and freaked out, but I was also a journalist, and this is a pretty big story. So I scrambled. I found a way to jump into a rental car. People were lined up, but there were these guys who managed to get one of the last rental cars, and they're saying, we're going home to New York. If you want to come with us, I jumped into it, drove all day. I got back to George Washington Bridge around 11 o'clock that night, walked across the bridge, found my way down, had a press pass, so I got back down to ground zero. And at that time, there was still a tremendous kind of sense of hope that there were going to be survivors. So I did these kind of live shots that we do, like up on the satellite, do a sort of broadcast. And then I started helping as part of the rescue effort, trying to sort of dig through the rubble and, find whatever survivors we could. Sadly, of course, we didn't find any. After that moment, what they did is, I went up to 14th Street where they had built this barrier for people not to be able to come down. And there was other journalists who were not able to come down and get a first-hand account. So they started asking the other journalists who had come out, like, what did you see? What's happening? What was your experience like? And so some woman grabbed me and started interviewing. And I started talking to her. And she said, what do you think happened out there? It was responsible for this. And I got to tell you, immediately, especially considering where I had just been a couple weeks earlier, I was already making the links, like a lot of people were, what I saw there, and I think has some connection here. And I started thinking to myself, oh my God, what are we going to do? The world literally is changing in this moment. And I thought about that sort of 15-year-old kid, and I started telling this woman who probably wanted some other story, but I started telling about this 15-year-old kid with the Superman t-shirt and this kind of conclusion in my part of the world, we don't have anything to believe in. And, you know, I'll tell you, this stretched out, you know, the dramatic sort of ending here would be like, I sort of went off on my own journey, but the truth is I lingered around being a journalist for a few more years, even though I should say, you know, as a son of the recruiter, my soul wasn't in it anymore. Because I started traveling and I was covering all of a sudden, I mean, everyone wanted to go to Afghanistan, Pakistan. I was doing a lot of stuff in Israel and the West Bank at the time. And, you know, I just started seeing right in front of me, like, the world's getting worse, it's not getting better. Every time you go back to Israel and Palestine, you know, more unemployment, more anger, more resentment, more violence. And, you know, as a journalist, in some ways, like, more violence the better, right? You sit around bars late at night hoping that there's going to be a suicide bombing so you can have something to come. And so, you know, I also felt sort of disgusted by that and realized, like, I can't do this anymore. And there was always that kid in the back of my head sort of telling me, we don't have heroes in this part of the world. So, this was a long way of sort of coming back to a relevant point, which is to say, at that point, I did sort of go back to my spirituality, and you know, I'm always fascinated by these comic books and these characters, and I thought to myself, we do have heroes in this part of the world. And I'm sort of looking at the subcontinent in general, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Sri Lanka, have the greatest vault of, I mean, superhero characters. Do you think the X-Men are badass? I mean, come see, like, you know, Arjuna and Krishna and, you know, these great heroes that we have. So, I started this idea, and I'm going to sort of show you some images, but basically, you know, I started this company, and I said, I want to be the one to help bring these characters to the world. And, you know, there was a business and commerce element, like, man, there is no Marvel Comics Media, this is a great opportunity. But there was also this sort of underlying thought that, you know, what happens in the absence of true heroes? Osama bin Laden's happened. Because, you know, when a culture is sort of undergoing a bankruptcy of aspirational heroes, great charismatic leaders fill that void. And say what you want, Osama bin Laden was one, you know, so was Hitler, so was a lot of these people who through, you know, centuries have been able to galvanize great groups or large groups of people. So that's what I started. When, as all these things take a journey, Richard Branson becomes involved, goes another direction. But it has always sort of remained the core idea, and, you know, now we live in this incredible world of digital media where, you know, all of us in this group can convert the story and get it out to the world. So I think we live in this incredible time, and the one sort of thing I would impart to you, because you have these amazing people here that I think can mentor you and are experts and have a lot to say. And I, you know, despite the fact that I guess I am quite removed from your generation, and I belong certainly not to the post-career generation, I think the one thing I can tell you is the greatest thing we have in the Hindu faith is this sense of dharma. And we also live in a time right now. Whatever your dharma is, you can pursue it, you can share it with the world. You don't need anyone's permission. So I consider myself a storyteller, whether it's a comic book or it's a documentary film or it's as an entrepreneur. I'm someone who wants to tell stories, but I also want to empower other people to tell stories. And I think all of you guys have stories. One of the great things of being in an environment like this is you all have stories. It's so clear. When I was sitting here, I was looking at my iPhone and I was looking at an email I just received from the last time I was here on campus. I met a kid who, it was during one of the TEDx events, and I connected with him, and I was really interested in what he was doing as a journalist, and he just sort of emailed me, ironically, while I'm here, and hear what kinds of activities, how you guys are sort of involved in all these dialogues, hear that there are other, you know, student leaders from other institutions, and they're all sharing these stories, and I have the ability to sort of edit them and tweak them, but then share them with the world. And you don't need the permission of movie studios or publishers or, you know, PhDs. You can do that, and I think that's incredibly empowering, not only to you guys, but to whoever you're able to share them with. So I think that's the one piece of advice, if I could offer, which is, meditate on what it is in your life that you're most passionate about, and nurture it, and have others nurture it. Through the world we live in, social networks and communities, you sort of release your intent out to the world, immediately you'll find other people who are there to support it, and that's an incredible gift. And I think you're the generation that will change the world, and I really genuinely believe that. So thank you for having me and letting me be a little bit